If we could grab our seats. Well, first let me just say thank you for yesterday. It was a fabulous day. I really enjoyed our speakers, and I hope you did too. But it also, I appreciate you coming and supporting the center and the conference, and also welcoming our Lens scholars. We had a wonderful reception last night, and got to know each other, and that's a big part of what this conference is about. Hoping to build those connections, you know, see old friends, make new friends, and think about the future, and really just enjoy each other's company, because it is kind of a unique group of people who are in this national security space, no matter whether you're a student, you're interested citizen, whether you're in the military or in government in some way. And I think one of the things that qualities that share is just an interest in the future of this country. And I think that says so many good things about all of you who are here. And I'm super pleased to introduce our keynote speaker today, Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, who I've known for at least 30 years. You know, we met as boys. No, actually, it was shortly after. General Deptula was the principal attack planner for Operation Desert Storm. And actually, I don't know if, sir, you're going to have any chance to talk a little bit about that, but the attack plan that was devised for that conflict was unique, very unique at the time, a very different way of thinking about using the air weapon, and it was done very, very effectively. He commanded no-fly zone operations, which, you know, I wasn't in his command, but I served in another part of the command, and it was that was a very tricky air operation, and required some, shall we say, convoluted rules of engagement from time to time. He's an F-15 pilot. He has over 3,000 hours, 400 in combat. Among other, he commanded a number of different operations, and please take a look at his full bio on the link. But one of the, I think, most interesting things about his background is that he was the first chief of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, what we call ISR in the military. And during that period, he was responsible for really implementing drone operations on a large-scale effort. And I can remember, you know, those meetings where there was never enough drones. You know, and people thought, oh, what's the big deal? You get one guy with a drone? No, it takes about 200 people involved in each drone sortie, and you never had enough of that ISR. Now, you can understand why people wanted that, but nevertheless, it was quite a challenge at the time. Now he's the Dean of the Mitchell Institute of Aerospace Studies, the leading non-governmental organization associated with air and space now, development and thinking. They're doing tremendous stuff. If you need to sign up for I get their news link because there's always things going on. They're putting out papers and so forth. It's kind of the intellectual center for air and space operations, and at least in the civilian sector. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome my friend, Lieutenant General Dave Deptula. He's powering through, I think, a little bit of a throat challenge, but here he is.
Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction, Charlie, and forgive me if I sound like a frog, but I think I'll be able to make it through today. It really is a pleasure and a privilege, and I've been looking forward to this. I have remarks. I will pass those on to you, but I'm really looking forward to engaging in some discussion afterwards. So hopefully my voice will hold out. I just do want to, and General Dunlap reminded me with respect to remotely piloted aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, whatever you'd like to call them. You know, for a while there, the Department of Defense, and they still are, I mean, sometimes they just don't acknowledge their mistakes. But they call them unmanned aerial systems. And here's the deal. There's absolutely nothing unmanned about the system. The little piece of fiberglass in the sky is uninhabited, but there is an architecture associated with each one of those things, and I'm proud you remembered it. It's about 200 people for every sortie or individual flight. So anyway, I digress. Charlie and I both have a passion for education. He mentioned I'm the dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and so opportunities like this are the absolute best investment of my time. Let me first start by saying that the Judge Advocate General Corps is absolutely indispensable to military operations. Of course, I think most of you in here would agree with that statement. As a warfighter, I've had the privilege of serving alongside some of the most skilled and dedicated Judge Advocate Generals or JAGs in the armed forces, General Dunlap being one of, if not the finest, and he didn't pay me to say that, that I've ever run into. A superb example of somebody who it really enables commanders, and that's what Judge Advocate Generals do. And so, you know, a lot of times lawyers get a bad rap, but in the context of, and if I was to summarize all my remarks up front, and my wife always tells me, stick to the script, because if you go off script, you're going to take forever to tell stories. But, you know, it is the benefit in the fact that commanders appreciate and embrace JAGs. Because as legal professionals, you're the ones who help commanders and decision makers exercise their roles while at the same time adhering to the laws of armed conflict. We protect and defend our nation and its interests through expertise, decisiveness, and aplomb. And if you look at today's global security environment, it's really highlighted the importance of the JAG Corps and revitalized discussion concerning the laws of armed conflict and how they're applied in modern warfare. Because as we're speaking today, and all of you know, and I understand you had some speakers yesterday speak to this topic, war has returned to Europe. The return of large-scale, state-on-state, conventional violence on the continent was a possibility that many had relegated to the 20th century in the brutal regimes of Hitler and Stalin. Yet here we are in 2023, facing a renewed assault on international law, norms, and values as Vladimir Putin continues his war of attrition and committing untoward atrocities against the sovereign nation of Ukraine. He's chosen to disregard the core of international humanitarian law with waves of cruise missiles deliberately targeting civilians, indiscriminate artillery barrages, laying waste to towns and villages, and unspeakable atrocities in places like Bucha, for which the full extent of these horrors we may not know for years. On the other side of the world, we face authoritarianism of a different brand. The Chinese Communist Party has taken an increasingly aggressive posture in the Pacific, launching missiles over Taiwan, harassing American vessels in international waters, and violating our own national airspace with spy balloons. Something in the news recently. The Chinese Communist Party suppresses dissent at home through their surveillance state, detains religious minorities, and violates democratic principles in places like Hong Kong. Increasingly, their gaze looks across the straits to Taiwan with designs on so-called national reunification by force. Our adversaries are devious, intentionally remaining in the gray zone of conflict, targeting our forces or infrastructure with cyber attacks to remain non-attributional with hopes of driving a disproportionate response by America and her allies. Our adversaries shield themselves using proxy forces to hide their atrocities on the battlefield to avoid liability and reprisal. We already see these techniques in play with Iran's use of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to sow chaos throughout the Middle East and their employment of Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Russians are also increasingly using the Wagner Group in Ukraine to distance themselves from attribution regarding violations of international norms. So it's through this framework that we must examine our adherence to the laws of armed conflict and how they apply to our strategy against these revanchist powers. And it's through this framework that our Judge Advocate Corps must be ready to operate and enable commanders for mission accomplishment. The JAGs are an integral part of operations, and their impact will be needed as we address wars in the future. They're an essential link in the kill chain as we find, fix, and finish enemy combatants in the battle space. As an operator who's been a Joint Task Force commander twice, Joint Force Air Component Commander, Charlie mentioned the Desert Storm Air Campaign, Commander of Air Ops for operations over Afghanistan, and in general, a pretty strong aerospace power advocate. I'm obsessed with closing the kill chain as soon as possible, while staying within moral, ethical, and legal bounds. Whether in the skies over Eastern Europe or the expanses of the Pacific, air and space operations can be decisive in deterring and, if necessary, defeating our potential allies, potential adversaries. Sometimes one and the same. Okay, we'll leave that to discussion. From controlling space operations to penetrating strikes, reconnaissance, and battle management, air interdiction and dynamic targeting, it's air and space power that will set the conditions to achieve vital effects against our adversaries. While the contributions of our joint partners are important, air and space power are crucial components of the kill chain in providing both critical information necessary to effectively target and then the lethal force with speed, lethality, and precision at range to achieve desired effects. So air power provides us with a powerful tool for achieving our objectives in the battle space, but it also comes with significant legal and ethical responsibilities that sometimes create significant challenges. The importance of our mission must not distract or deter us from the moral obligation we assume as practitioners of warfare. Conversely, we must not allow our reliance on burdensome and onerous policy and bureaucracy to threaten victory in the battle space. So a couple of war stories. When I was a principal attack planner for the Desert Storm Coalition Air Campaign in 1991, our objective was to paralyze Iraq's leadership and command and control so we could subsequently gain and maintain air superiority to permit unhindered air operations, target key systems, negate its offensive military capability, destroy its weapons of mass destruction, and render his army in Kuwait ineffective, causing their collapse. And our operation benefited from the latest missile technology, military technology, including stealth bombers, cruise missiles, and sort of the introduction of smart weapons, if you will, that we now all take for granted. We were able to rapidly strike our targets because of broad authorities and rules of engagement that were not overly restrictive, as well as having a JAG in our planning cell who enabled swift, lethal, and moral prosecution of our plans. And only once during the Desert Storm Air Campaign was there a no. And that came from the JAG at Tactical Air Command at the time, who I didn't even know received a copy of what we called our master attack plan on a daily basis. But we wanted to show the Iraqi people, this is kind of a psychological application of air power, that Saddam Hussein had lost control. And so what we wanted to do was take down the crossed swords, huge swords in downtown Baghdad. Some of you might, I know Charlie's shaking.
Everybody has a picture.
Okay, but we wanted to take those down along with a statue of Saddam in the middle of Baghdad. But the Tactical Air Command Judge Advocate General said that those were historical monuments, so we couldn't hit them. Okay, we could live with that, and we won the war regardless. But that was the only no. Now, in the late 90s, 98 and 99 to be exact, I had the good fortune to be the Combined Joint Task Force Commander for Operation Northern Watch. That was the no-fly zone in northern Iraq. Better termed an air exclusion zone, it was a territorial bounded area in which Iraq's air and surface operations were controlled, even to the point of preclusion against their will as a tool of foreign policy. More specifically, an air exclusion zone is an area in which the target nation's sovereignty has been expropriated with the goal of producing a set of political effects. This definition is more universally applicable than the traditional no-fly zone implies because it encompasses a wider spectrum of political use. In fact, the term air control zone is probably an even more accurate definition of the concept that I'm describing. However, because that's sort of a basic term in the aviation lexicon, its use might be confusing, so nobody uses it anymore. But by 1998, the no-fly zones in both northern and southern Iraq had been in place for 7 years, since the end of Desert Storm in 91. So very specific procedures that were based on strict rules of engagement were established as a key element, and that was no weapons could be employed without the specific authorization of the Combined Joint Task Force commander. Now, on December 28, 1998, we had an Operation Northern Watch force package that was back over northern Iraq after 3 or 4 days of no-fly operations because there was this operation called Desert Strike that was being conducted in Baghdad. I won't go into all the details, but they used a bunch of cruise missiles because they found out that Saddam was trying to, some of you might remember, kill George Bush when he came to visit Kuwait. Anyway, so we had not flown in that area. We go back into the area, and toward the middle of that first vulnerability window, an Iraqi SA-3 surface-to-air missile, or SAM, launched 3 surface-to-air missiles at a flight of our F-16s. Those missiles were skillfully avoided by the F-16 pilots. And dutifully, the airborne mission commander radioed back to the command center where I was sitting the request to employ force. And so as a Joint Task Force commander, I approved it immediately. Within 7 minutes, the Iraqi SA-3 target tracking radar and the associated 3 surface-to-air missile launchers were smoking holes in the desert. Now, after that engagement, excuse me, I pondered why the established Operation Northern Watch, what we called consolidated operating standards, which were essentially the rules of engagement, required the Combined Joint Task Force commander to authorize the employment of forces in situations where the international laws of armed conflict already allowed direct response to self-defense, right? I mean, that's sort of basic tenet. So I made the decision at that time to rewrite those consolidated operating standards to give the authority to employ force to the airborne mission commander while retaining for the Joint Task Force commander the authority to terminate engagement if conditions warranted. And I spent a lot of time with my Judge Advocate General in reviewing our consolidated operating standards because these new ones had to be approved by the Turkish General Staff. Anybody work with the Turks in here? I'm here to tell you that it's not an easy crowd. But be that as it may, I also wanted to assure the greatest degree of flexibility to engage targets in Iraq that posed a threat to my forces. So I put a line in there that read that our Operation Northern Watch forces could respond to any element of the Iraqi integrated air defense system if we witnessed a hostile act, not just the specific site committing the hostile act. And so we went up to Ankara, the capital of Turkey, and we met with the leadership of the Turkish Air Force. Prior to this, with my JAG as a partner, we went through every word of what these consolidated operating standards is, essentially a 25-page document. You go, my God, well, you all wouldn't understand that. Most fighter pilots wouldn't understand why rules of engagement had to consist of 25 pages, but anyway. So I go up there, and an Army Colonel, JAG, he was the guy from European Command, had accompanied me to this meeting, and I just first met him that morning at the ambassador's residence, which is where I was staying. And we didn't have a lot of time to pre-brief, but I did explain kind of the situation to him. During this session with the Turkish General Staff 2-star and his JAG, along with me and this colonel, I was a 1-star at the time, we went through every line of that document. You know, you sit there And you wait for, okay, you good? Yeah, okay, we move on. And every time there was a particular question that the Turkish General Staff General wanted reworded or adjusted, I agreed. Because my whole philosophy here was not to fall on my sword on anything. I wanted to get to that one line and get through it. And we'd studied the document, and there really wasn't anything in there that, you know, to fall on your sword about. So we're flying through this review process, so much so that the Army JAG leaned over to me, and actually he was sort of visibly shaking. And he goes, "Sir, this is normally a 2-week process, and you're going through this like in 2 hours." I said, "Don't worry about it." And, you know, and so when we got to that critical line that I wanted the Turks to agree to, they didn't raise an issue. So after that, as far as I was concerned, we were home free. Now, it is funny, we go back to, because Admiral, I'm trying to think of his name. I shouldn't have done this. I'm going off script. I'll think of his name in a minute. Anyway, he was the vice commander of European Command. General Wes Clark was the commander. I'm sorry?
Steve Abbott?
Yeah. Thank you. Admiral Abbott. There he's walking out with the ambassador, and they're going to play tennis. And they go, "What are you guys doing back already?" I go, "Hey, we got what we wanted." The Army colonel, I'll never forget it. He's going, "It was too fast. It was too fast." I said, "Hey, man, relax. You know, we got what we wanted accomplished." Anyway, the empowerment of the force on scene to make engagement decisions was absolutely liberating for the task force and the mission at hand. And by the spring of 1999, the Iraqi Air Defense Forces in northern Iraq no longer possessed any SAMs, as they were rendered completely ineffective because of this change in the rules of engagement that was not just assisted by, but enabled by the partnership that I developed with the Judge Advocate General. And oh, by the way, Northern Watch at the time, this is before the Air Force had implemented its Aerospace Expeditionary Rotation Plan. Folks would come in every 45 days, so, and then rotate out. I had 6 executive officers in 2 years. It was ridiculous how fast people were coming in. But having somebody come in, hit the ground, understand the circumstances, and partner, like I just described, was absolutely incredible. In fact, the commander of the no-fly zone in southern Iraq, Operation Southern Watch, called me in the late spring of '99 and he said, "Dave, how are you able to do this?" And I answered that, "Well, look, I've got all the operational authorities to engage upon hostile intent by the enemy and built the conditions to do just that." And what he relayed to me was that the command arrangements of his forces that he was operating under required pilots to seek permission to engage not just from himself as the Operation Southern Watch commander, but then he required approval from his higher headquarters, which was Central Command Air Forces, and often additionally from Central Command itself, and sometimes all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. Folks, that does not work. It just constrains and hinders our forces. The impact upon the unit personnel between the two very different leadership paradigms was dramatic. And the work of my JAG and Northern Watch, as I mentioned, was critical in empowering me to tackle rewriting of those consolidated operating standards. So 10 years after Desert Storm, I had the good fortune to serve as the Director of Air Operations in response to the Al-Qaeda attacks on 9/11. Now, rather than striking enemy command and control and infrastructure in the Iraqi desert to achieve strategic paralysis of the enemy, like we did in Desert Storm, we now targeted terrorists and their associated networks in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. The difference in operational constraints associated with the conflicts was dramatic. Application of the laws of armed conflict to counterinsurgency operations was affected by new policies that severely constrained attacks to avoid civilian casualties. Now, this was appropriate given the nature of the fight. However, one of the points that I'd like to make here and reinforce with an example, and this is important, in the military, the JAG's advice and recommendations are just that. They're advice and recommendations. It's up to the commander to make the judgment whether to take the advice or respond in a different manner due to operational circumstances. And in this example that I'm going to give you, the operational commander listened to his JAG and elected not to use force when, in my humble opinion, the correct operational call from a strategic perspective would have been to destroy the target. I'll lay this out for you and then you can make your own decision. This involved the first use of an armed MQ-1 Predator drone in Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7, 2001. The first night of what was to become the longest war in American history, but it could have been the shortest war in American history if the commander had made the right call to use force when he chose not to. Using a Predator drone, we watched the commander of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, leave his compound in Kandahar and then move to a location around 13 kilometers southwest and go into a building. Actually, it was an adobe mud hut. Now, I got two fighter aircraft armed with 1,000-pound bombs waiting 20 miles to the south because we didn't want the sound to, alert the folks in the vicinity. And we're waiting for approval from the Central Command Commander, General Tommy Franks, to drop those weapons on that building. By the way, it's in a village. It's really a collection of adobe mud huts. And guess what? The approval never came because the Central Command Judge Advocate advised General Franks that the collateral damage error circle extended such that it encompassed one of the adobe mud huts. In the absence of his decision to drop the bombs on the building where Mullah Omar and his entire Taliban senior staff was meeting, a decision was made by another party from another government agency, CIA, to launch a Hellfire missile, because they were the ones controlling it at the time, against one of the trucks that delivered Omar to the location, which was empty outside the building. The rationale, and it's kind of interesting because I talked to the guy that actually made the decision, and he said that he knew that Franks was never going to approve the strike, so they had to come up with something to do. And it was an attempt to frighten Omar, get him to run out of the building, at which time the Predator would ostensibly follow him to re-engage at a later point. Of course, that didn't happen. And for over a decade, we chased Mullah Omar, and we never found him until he was reported dead from tuberculosis in 2013, 12 years later. Now, imagine the strategic impact of killing Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, and the entire senior Taliban staff on the first night of Enduring Freedom. We gave that up. We gave up that strategic opportunity due to an excessive, unwarranted, and misplaced concern over collateral damage. Now, I also want to put this in context. This is about 2 years after the collective we, hit the Chinese embassy in downtown Belgrade. I'm here to tell you a couple of adobe mud huts outside of Kandahar is not downtown Belgrade. And so there was too much focus, again, my humble opinion, by the commander on, avoiding any possibility of collateral damage. But look what was given up in the context of that. I think he should have realized it was clearly worth taking the risk relative to the strategic value of eliminating the leadership of the Taliban the first night of the war. The other thing I want to get across to you is the difference in control in that 10 years between Desert Storm in 91 and Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001. It was absolutely dramatic. In fact, there was one point in time, and no one really knows about this. I mean, one of these days I'm going to write a book. But at one point, General Schwarzkopf, I'm talking about in 91, had made it a court-martial offense, this was just one of his emotional outbursts, for anyone in Riyadh to talk to anybody in Washington, D.C. True story. And then 10 years later, and this is true too, we could not drop a bomb in Afghanistan without the four-star general and Central Command approving it. So you have this dramatic disparity, it's incredible because during Desert Storm, I had absolutely no higher headquarters boards or reviews for the conduct of targeting. I received guidance from General Schwarzkopf through General Horner and acted upon that guidance to build the attack plans. And like I said, we had a JAG in the planning cell. He'd look at the stuff and off we'd go. During Enduring Freedom, a mere 10 years later, like I said, we couldn't drop a bomb without the four-star general's approval. Part of that I attribute to the phenomena of modern telecommunications that enable decisions now to be made at the highest possible level. And I suggest to you that just because they can be made at that level doesn't mean that they should. And so when I have the opportunity to brief, war college classes and stuff like that, I go, listen, as you progress in rank, you need to discipline yourself to stay at the level that you're at. There's a great example, here I go off script again, but General Clark in Allied force in Kosovo, Lieutenant General Mike Short was the air component commander. And Clark had a Predator video feed on his desk, and one day he picked up the phone, called General Short and said, hey, what are you doing about those 2 tanks under that tree? You're the supreme Allied commander in Europe. It's not your job to be telling me how to choke chickens down at a tactical level. Anyway, that's it. Micromanagement is a disease, and we need to keep our leadership away from going down that track. Okay, so as the war in Afghanistan continued, there was an increase in restrictions and the impact on the employment of air power. So let me jump forward to 2013 now, where the Obama administration levied restrictions on targeting adversaries requiring near certainty in order to avoid civilian casualties. Without a doubt, these restrictions contributed to the protracted nature of Operation Enduring Freedom and the frustration of commanders and air crews operating in theater. Now, we've got to remain vigilant as officers and legal professionals to continue to balance the necessity of military operations and the desire to reduce suffering and civilian casualties. But as I hope you'll take away from the example of the opening night of Enduring Freedom, every decision should not be made on the basis of civilian casualties. So as the United States prepares for future conflict, I worry about the legal interpretation of some of the principles designed to minimize the impact of war on civilians and protect those who are not taking part in hostilities. And let me emphasize the word minimize, because unfortunately, war is not going to be without some cost in life. There's a tendency to let the policies of the previous war dictate the rules for future conflict, even as the threat and operational considerations change. Let me give you another example, and this is the air campaign against the Islamic State, or Operation Inherent Resolve. On the heels of counterinsurgency ops in Iraq and the drawdown of American forces, the Caliphate rushed into the region, committing untold atrocities and vying for a violent pan-Arab Islamic State. The resulting air war sought to destroy ISIS in their dreams of extremist caliphate. While the air war was prosecuted with amazing skill and courage by our forces, policy holdovers from previous conflicts crept into operational decision-making in the targeting process. Nowhere was this more evident than in the reluctance to target oil infrastructure associated with the Islamic State. Now, the RAND Corporation called oil the single most important source of income for ISIS, with oil sales topping 40,000 barrels per day and revenues lining terrorist pockets to the tune of $1 million every 24 hours. Yet Central Command, under the direction of the White House, instituted a zero civilian casualty standard, meaning that no target could be struck if there was any chance of a civilian casualty. Letting concern of the consequences of unintentional collateral damage become excessive to the requirements of the laws of armed conflict, in my opinion, became self-defeating. For example, the coalition forces of Operation Inherent Resolve did not attack the oil distribution system of the Islamic State until December 2015, which was nearly 15 months after they began operations. The rationale for why they did not was the presumption that the fuel truck drivers were simply trying to earn a living. Well, the fact of the matter is they were supporting adversary action and were legitimate targets according to the laws of armed conflict. The coalition did not hit the oil distribution until they came up with a scheme of flying low, dropping leaflets, warning the drivers to get out of the vehicles. Okay, fine, it's an excellent precautionary tactic, but why wait 15 months to do that? Because CENTCOM leadership was concerned with the potential blowback in the press if the oil distribution truck drivers got killed. Meanwhile, over $700 million was pumped into the Islamic State's coffers from the sale of that oil, its distribution and delivery. And that allowed the Islamic State to conduct hundreds, if not thousands, of murders and despicable acts against innocent men, women, and children. So one can make the case that those who made the decisions to delay the halting of the distribution of oil, a critical means of income for the Islamic State, were to a degree complicit in the deaths of innocent civilians. Their excessive concern to save civilians and misapplication of the laws of armed conflict actually resulted in greater civilian casualties than a rapid and robust application of force to halt resources the Islamic State relied on to conduct crimes against humanity. So, as we move from 2 decades of counterinsurgency, we must be vigilant that we do not superimpose the restrictions of the last war over a future fight, or the consequences may be catastrophic. Unfortunately, I'm not convinced that we're serious about modifying our policies and practices as we move beyond the post-9/11 wars. I recently grew especially concerned over the interpretation of the laws of armed conflict among senior defense leaders with the Pentagon's Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan that was released last summer. While its intentions may have been good-natured, it's a backward-looking policy toward an era of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations that has very limited applicability in pure conflict. Conditions will be very much different in the contested operations of a major regional conflict in Europe or in the Western Pacific. Now, these conditions don't relieve us as military professionals of our obligations in doing our utmost to execute ops while minimizing or avoiding civilian casualty. It means that the intensity of conflict is not going to allow for the exquisite, centralized analysis for the prosecution of each and every target. Post-9/11 armed conflicts often require the United States to restrain its overwhelming advantages in ways and means through policy limitations much stricter than those required under the law of armed conflict. But as we advance toward a pure fight, we are relying on judge advocates to emphasize the distinction between policy and law and free commanders to employ the widest range of capabilities possible to minimize human suffering while still ensuring victory. Nowhere is this more important than a potential conflict with the People's Republic of China. The pivot to the Pacific marks a change in context, environment, and most importantly, a distinct change in the nature and capabilities of our adversary. During Desert Storm, we plan to instruct targets on the order of magnitude of around 40,000 aim points through the duration of the conflict. In a war with China, we can expect strikes on the scale of 100,000 or more aim points alone in the area of the Taiwan Straits. The sheer scale of that operation will not allow for the advanced planning, weaponeering, and collateral damage reduction techniques that we've used over the past 20 years, or that are inherent in this guidance that the Secretary of Defense just handed out. Likewise, the highly contested nature of the theater is going to drive information gaps, lower awareness, and miscalculation as the United States and our partners fight through jamming, spoofing, decoys, so on and so forth. We will no longer possess the uncontested airspace of Iraq and Afghanistan that allowed for our continuous full-motion video, pattern of life development, and strikes at the time and place of our choosing. During the war against the Islamic State, one planner in the Combined Air Operations Center told me that it took upwards of 45 to 50 days to fully vet a target, or meaning get approved for a strike. To wit, I said, do you understand that Desert Storm only lasted 43 days? If we use those processes, we'd still be there today. Targets in the Taiwan Straits will be heavily defended, fleeting, and highly mobile. Any delays that result from interruptions in the kill chain will prolong the lifespan of enemy threats and put American aircrews at an unacceptable level of risk. So in a conflict with China, we can't afford to miss opportunities. A potential war with China will also be conducted at a level of technological innovation and lethality never seen before. As technology advances between the United States and China, we'll need our lawyers on the front line of looming moral questions regarding artificial intelligence and the use of autonomous weapons. Legal professionals should not be limited to simply the end use of these weapons, but they need to be integrated by design at the algorithmic level. That means the design of the artificial intelligence and the machine learning, guaranteeing that our values are incorporated into the systems that we design. That's a lecture of an hour and a half or 2 hours all on its own. Finally, while the consequences for failure in counterinsurgency fights are serious and should not be trivialized, they pale in comparison to the consequences of failure against a pure adversary. The risk of defeat in counterinsurgency, while serious, are generally local and recoverable. A loss at the hands of a pure adversary will be catastrophic and could very well change the global balance of power. So it'll largely fall on our JAG Corps to thread the needle between abiding by the legal framework, the laws of armed conflict, and enabling our commanders to optimize the tools at their disposal to win. This job won't be easy, and it's going to test all of us. However, we must not allow our adversaries to use our adherence to the law as their asymmetric advantage. They try to do that throughout enduring freedom, Iraqi freedom, and inherent resolve. Likewise, in our effort to win the next war, we must not sacrifice the values and principles which make our American way of war so unique. The autocracies of Russia and China consider life cheap and have no compunction with breaking the laws of armed conflict. We can rest assured that they will not exercise the same diligence as America and our allies in minimizing human suffering and limiting casualties. However, we must not come down to their level. We must not become like our adversaries simply in an effort to defeat them. So in this fight, you all and our judge advocates in general will be on the leading edge of policy development and are absolutely essential in bringing us victory while supporting our values, ideals, and laws. So with that, let me stop. Thank you very much for your attention. I see that nobody is sleeping, so I accomplished my objective, and I look forward to your questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, General Deptula has kindly agreed to take some questions. Brian? Jeff, see what happens when age hits your eyesight?
Thank you very much, sir, for the great presentation. My name is Professor Jeff Korn, and I will admit that I think I was a little bit peripherally influential on the development of the CHIMRAP. I agree with you that it can be potentially damaging if it's misunderstood, but I would ask you to consider two aspects to it. Number one, it's premised on the foundation of precautions, and the key word that so many people seem to miss is the word feasible. So I think, like operational art itself, legal regulation is itself scalable to different types of operational contexts. So if you were to suggest, or if anybody were to suggest to me that the precautionary measures that were implemented in a non-international armed conflict against a non-state organized armed group should be identical to those that are implemented against a peer enemy like China or Russia, it's absurd, and it's not what the law requires. And I think the CHIMRAP is designed to emphasize that point, that all it's saying is you're always obligated to do what is feasible under the circumstances. I think the other feature of it is it's designed to enhance the capability of operational commanders at every level to act autonomously in a decentralized combat operation so that they are the focal point of implementing these obligations. I think if understood in that context, it actually makes more sense than what maybe we've been doing and actually brings us back more towards your experience in the Gulf War than the later experiences, because we know that commanders are not going to have that capability of always having reach back to legal advice. So I'm just curious.
I love you like a brother. But
yeah, okay. Just curious if,
we want to get questions.
in proper context, do you think it could be beneficial?
Let me say it this way.
You go ahead.
Is based on what we know now from the press, do you see it as an improvement over the existing system where you have intelligence officers and JAGs in the command center, or do you think a new system would make it better, the proposed system?
Okay, thanks for the question. Thanks for the explanation. But if you read it, I did not derive any of what you just explained to me out of that set of guidelines. It does not come across at all like you described. And I don't believe that there's any requirement for significant change to going back to the system that we had, or maybe not going back to, but keeping the system that we had with commanders receiving legal interpretation and advice from their judge advocate generals that are assigned to them.
Great. And thanks a lot, Joe. Do we have let's get a,
By the way, that was a great explanation. I mean, but I would suggest you go back and rewrite the document. Because it doesn't read that way. It doesn't read that way.
Jeff has actually written a blog post where he explains that. I tend to agree with General Deptula. The document does not exactly track with that. So
it talks about centralized committees.
Send us a link to, because you wrote something on Articles of War on that. So I can get it out to the students and anybody else who's interested, because what Jeff's saying makes a lot of sense. It doesn't track, in my judgment, with the document as well as maybe the directors wanted it. Anyway.
Good morning, General. So I'm Zej Moshe-Złowska, 1L at New York Law School. And I'm kind of going through this whole conversation through the kind of perspective of a ground fighter in the Army. And when you're talking about the role of JAG in the kill chain, I'm kind of thinking about a JAG sitting in a skiff, looking at, overhead of guys and gals on the ground, waiting for a green light or a red light. And as a future JAG, I'm kind of curious, to whom would who's my client? Is it the guys and gals on the ground? Is it the task force commander? Is it the commander in chief? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out where that line is and what our role is ultimately on that type of topic.
The short answer is it depends on where you're assigned in terms of who your client is. In the case that I gave you, the client of the European Command, JAG, was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, which is a very much different level than being down there with forces engaged on the ground. So I tell you, whatever organizational level you're assigned to, that's who your client is. Yes, sir.
Charlie, I know we're running out of time. I don't want to get as many questions as I can. Thanks, Brian.
Hi, I'm
Actually is Brian.
Brian Cox. I'm a lecturer at Cornell Law School and a retired Army JAG. So just to build really briefly off the comments earlier about the CHIMRAP, I share your concern about scalability in terms of how we may implement it, right? So the devil is really going to be in the details on how we implement it. If we implement it poorly, it will end up being, it will hobble commanders, as you said in your Defense One piece. So my brief question is, have you been kind of monitoring the air war in Ukraine in the way that the Ukrainians have been conducting the air war? And have you been drawing any lessons from the conflict in Ukraine that we can use in future conflicts? Thanks.
It's a wonderful question. The short answer is, to the degree that I can, based on the reporting that is out there. I really caution folks. I mean, we have some people that are writing out there that are drawing conclusions, and we really have to be careful about drawing conclusions before the conflict is complete. Yeah, there are implications, and my biggest concern is there are a couple of folks out there that are writing about this notion of air denial, and they're ascribing rationale to what the Ukrainians are doing, and then they're taking that and they're suggesting that the United States accept that as their air doctrine as opposed to the whole notion of air superiority. And it's like, are you people crazy? Do you not understand that the Ukrainians are in an existential fight, literally, and they're doing everything they possibly can with the resources that they have, which, oh, by the way, are not the same resources that the United States has. So how can you ascribe what you're observing, which, oh, by the way, may not be intentional strategy built by the Ukrainians, but it could be because the Russians have a doctrine that's different than ours. They got crummy leadership. They don't have any training, and their aircraft aren't all that what they're cracked up to be. So maybe that's the cause, not, I mean, and this is, here I am in a semi-academic environment, and I don't want to besmirch academics, okay? But you know, really? And by the way, this one of these people is a former associate professor at the Air War College, and another guy is a mobility guy. I just leave it at this. We have to be careful ascribing lessons to conditions that are very different than we might face.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're going to have some time if you can hang around
Sure.
afterwards. But I got to ask you one question because I've been asked it. Why do we have to use an F-22 to shoot down?
Hey, it's a great question. It's kind of humorous. Even in the F-22 community, my son's an F-22, was a squadron commander. And the answer is because no other airplane can go up to that altitude. People say, well, why is that? Well, because it's got 70,000 pounds of thrust, all right? And the balloon's at 65,000 feet. There's no other airplane that can go. Okay, a U-2 can go up there. But I've been in a U-2 at 72,000 feet. Okay, you have a 2-mile-an-hour speed restriction. If you go faster than that, the wings will come off because you've exceeded the dynamic load on the wings. If you go slower than that, you'll stall the aircraft and fall out of the sky. Okay, but the F-22 is the only airplane that can operate at that altitude. So that's the short answer.
And should we spend a lot of money to upgrade the remaining 33 F-22s?
Well, we should not retire the remaining 3 F-22s, and they don't require any upgrade. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do an op-ed on this pretty soon because the Air Force, because they are restricted in the resource allocation that they have, are following this approach of divest to invest, which is a bankrupt approach. What it means is, hey, we're going to give up force structure that we have to save money so we can buy new stuff. And so here's the fallacy of that strategy. When you give the money back to the government, it doesn't have a little tie around it that says save for the Air Force. It goes back into the federal treasury, all right? And in 2 years, when the Air Force is coming back to the table, they have to make the new case again. You got a whole number of people, and when the leadership of the Air Force says, well, what about that money that we saved? They go, what are you talking about? Anyway, they wanted to divest 33 training F-22s that we have. We only have 182 of the airplanes right now, which aren't sufficient. This is the most capable airplane, fighter combat aircraft, that was ever developed. Why would you give up 33? To save money? That's insane. Sorry, I don't have any strong feelings on this subject.
Gee, I
Thanks
didn't know
very
that
much.
was going to happen.
Thanks, Charlie.
General Deptula, thank you so much for taking time out of